It began on the night the stars stopped moving. Harold Brennan had been watching them for 37 years from the same rusted lawn chair outside his farmhouse in Harlan County, Nebraska. He knew their patterns the way other men knew the lines on their wives' faces, intimately without thinking. But on that October evening something changed. The constellations hung frozen, as if the universe itself had paused mid-breath. He sat there with his coffee growing cold, squinting at the sky through glasses held together with electrical tape. The crickets had gone silent an hour ago. Even the wind, that constant prairie companion, had abandoned him. Harold was 63 years old and carried the kind of loneliness that settles into a man's bones after his wife dies and his children scatter to cities with names he can barely pronounce. The farm still stood, barely, held together by habit and stubbornness. Most nights he fell asleep to the sound of his own breathing, wondering if God had forgotten his name. But tonight felt different. The first sign came at 11:47 p.m. A light appeared above the northern horizon, not a plane, not a satellite. It moved with intention, carving a slow arc across the darkness. Harold stood, his arthritic knees protesting, coffee cup slipping from his fingers to the dirt below. The light descended. He should have been afraid. Every instinct bred into a practical man screamed at him to run inside, lock the doors, call someone. But Harold found himself walking toward it instead, drawn by something he couldn't name. The object settled in his wheat field, 300 yards from the house, its glow turning the autumn stalks silver. The air tasted different, electric, alive, like the moment before lightning strikes. Harold stopped at the edge of his field. The craft, if that's what it was, made no sound. It simply existed there, radiating a warmth that had nothing to do with heat. Slowly, a section of its surface shifted, creating an opening that seemed less like a door and more like a thought becoming visible. What emerged wasn't what he expected. The being stood perhaps 7 feet tall, but height seemed irrelevant, as if the creature existed in dimensions Harold's eyes couldn't fully process. Its form shimmered between solid and translucent, like heat rising from summer asphalt. Where a face should have been, there was only light. Not blinding, but present, aware, conscious. It wore no expression because it needed none. Everything it was existed in the space around it, in the feeling it carried like a voice without sound. Harold's heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth opened, but no words came. The being didn't move closer, didn't advance. It simply stood there, patient as stone, as if it had all the time creation could offer. Then it spoke, not with language, but with knowing. The communication came as a sensation that bloomed in Harold's chest and spread outward like warmth through cold water. Images flickered through his mind, not his own memories, but something older, vaster. He saw the earth from impossible distances, spinning blue and fragile in an ocean of darkness. He saw civilizations rise and fall like wheat stalks in seasons. He saw patterns, endless, beautiful patterns, woven through everything that lived and breathed and died. And he saw something else. He saw a moment approaching, a threshold humanity was racing toward, without realizing it. The being showed him this, not as warning, but as fact, the way you might point out a river to someone who'd been walking beside it their whole life without noticing the water. The revelation came slowly, carefully, as if the being understood that human minds could only hold so much truth at once before breaking. Harold saw that the universe was not empty. It had never been empty. Consciousness filled every corner of existence, flowing through dimensions his species had barely begun to imagine. And somewhere in that vast intelligence, woven through all of it like threads in fabric, was something the being could only describe in concepts Harold's mind translated as light that remembers and love that built worlds. God, but not the God of his Sunday school classes or the tired sermons he'd sat through in his youth. This was something both smaller and infinitely larger, present in every atom, every thought, every moment of suffering and joy. The being showed him that humanity had been speaking to this presence since the beginning, calling it by 10,000 names, building 10,000 temples, and somehow, miraculously, all of them had been reaching toward the same truth. Harold's knees gave out. He collapsed into the wheat, hands pressed against the cool earth, tears streaming down his weathered face. He understood now why the prophets in his grandmother's Bible had always fallen to the ground when angels appeared. The human body wasn't built to hold this much knowing. The being moved closer, gliding over the wheat without disturbing it. It placed something in Harold's mind, not a message, but a memory that didn't belong to him. He saw a man in ancient robes walking through a desert, speaking words that echoed across centuries. He saw that same figure appearing throughout history, wearing different faces, speaking different languages, but always carrying the same light. The being showed him that this pattern would repeat one final time, but differently. The return was coming. Not as judgment, not as destruction, but as awakening. Harold saw humanity standing at the edge of transformation, about to remember what it had forgotten, that every soul was a fragment of something infinite, that separation was an illusion, that death was a doorway, not an ending. The being revealed that those who were ready would simply shift. They would move into a state of existence where love wasn't an emotion, but the fundamental force holding reality together. The rapture, his grandmother would have called it. But the being showed him it wasn't about being chosen or saved. It was about remembering, about becoming, about finally seeing clearly what had always been true. Time lost meaning. Harold knelt in that wheat field for what felt like hours, downloading millennia of understanding into his finite mind. The being showed him why they came, these travelers between stars, not to save humanity but to witness it, to honor the transformation, to hold space for the moment when another species crossed the threshold from sleeping to waking. They had seen it happen before on worlds Harold had no names for. They would see it happen again, but each time was unique, precious, sacred. The being showed him one final thing, a warning wrapped in compassion. Not all would cross over. Some would refuse, clinging to fear and separation, like drowning men clutching stones. And that was allowed. That was the gift of choice, the terrible freedom every conscious being carried. Those who remained would continue learning, living, dying, until they too were ready. No one was lost. No one was abandoned. The light simply waited, patient as starlight, for each soul to find its own way home. When the vision finally released him, Harold found himself alone in the wheat field. The craft was gone. Dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. His knees ached from kneeling on the hard ground. His face was wet with tears and dew, but everything had changed. Harold walked back to his farmhouse on legs that felt new, as if he'd borrowed someone else's body. The world looked different, sharper, more alive. He could see the way light moved through the morning air, could feel the earth breathing beneath his feet, could sense the consciousness flowing through every living thing around him. The kitchen was exactly as he'd left it. Dirty dishes in the sink, yesterday's newspaper on the table, his wife's coffee mug still sitting on the counter, though she'd been gone 3 years. But these objects no longer felt like evidence of absence. They felt like memories held in physical form, love that had taken shape as porcelain and newsprint and worn countertops. Harold stood in his kitchen and laughed. Not from happiness exactly, but from the absurdity of having lived 63 years without seeing what had been right in front of him all along. He didn't call anyone. What would he say? Who would believe a farmer claiming angels drove UFOs, and God was real but not the way anyone expected? Instead, he made coffee and sat at his table, watching the sunrise through the window, feeling something vast and gentle holding him the way a parent might hold a sleeping child. The days that followed were quiet. Harold continued his routines, feeding chickens, checking fences, maintaining equipment, but everything carried new weight, new meaning. He began noticing things he'd overlooked before, the way his dog watched him with ancient knowing eyes, the patterns Frost made on his truck windshield, the feeling that arose when he held soil in his hands, that strange sense of coming home to a place he'd never left. His neighbors noticed the change. Earl Patterson, who farmed the adjacent property, mentioned that Harold seemed different, calmer somehow, less burdened. Harold only smiled and offered coffee. What could he say? That he'd been shown the blueprints of creation by a being made of light, that everything they believed about life and death and purpose was both completely wrong and perfectly right. The being had told him, without words, but clearly, that the truth couldn't be spoken directly. It could only be lived. Those who were ready would recognize it not in his explanations, but in his presence, in the way he moved through the world, carrying peace like a lantern. 3 weeks after the encounter, Harold's daughter called. Margaret lived in Denver and hadn't spoken to him in 8 months, nursing old resentments from a childhood that felt like it belonged to different people. The conversation was awkward at first, stilted with the weight of unsaid things. But then Harold did something he'd never done before. He listened, really listened, without defending himself, without explaining, without needing to be right. He heard the pain in Margaret's voice, the little girl still waiting for a father who'd been too busy keeping a failing farm alive to notice her, and instead of arguing, he simply said he understood, that he was sorry, that he loved her regardless of whether she ever forgave him. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long. Then Margaret began crying, quiet, surprised tears, because something in her father's voice had changed. Something essential had softened. They talked for 2 hours. By the end, Margaret mentioned she might visit for Thanksgiving. Harold hung up the phone and stood in his kitchen, overwhelmed by gratitude for the being who had shown him that transformation didn't require grand gestures. It only required presence, attention, love offered without conditions. November came cold and clear. Harold spent his evenings in that same lawn chair, watching the stars that now moved again in their ancient patterns. Sometimes he wondered if the encounter had been real, or if he'd experienced some kind of breakdown, a hallucination born from loneliness and isolation. But then he'd remember the feeling, that overwhelming knowing that had filled him like light pouring into an empty vessel. Memory couldn't manufacture that kind of certainty. Dreams couldn't leave this kind of residue. One evening, as the first snow began falling, Harold saw another light in the sky. His heart quickened. The craft moved slowly across the northern horizon, but this time it didn't descend. It simply passed, acknowledging him perhaps, reminding him that he wasn't alone, that watchers remained present, even when invisible. Harold raised his hand in greeting, in thanks, in goodbye. The light continued on its path, disappearing beyond the curve of the earth. He sat there as snow collected in his hair and on his shoulders, feeling no cold, no fear, only a deep peace that seemed to emanate from his bones. He understood now why the ancient texts spoke of shepherds and fishermen, of simple people in ordinary places receiving extraordinary truths. The profound didn't announce itself with trumpets and ceremony. It arrived in wheat fields and kitchens. It spoke to those whose hands knew the texture of soil and whose hearts remembered how to be still. December brought Margaret home. She arrived with her husband and 2 children Harold barely knew, carrying tension in her shoulders like a coat she couldn't remove. But something happened during that visit. Maybe it was the way Harold held his grandson, fully present, asking questions and listening to answers. Maybe it was the peace that seemed to fill the old farmhouse, making it feel less like a museum of loss and more like a sanctuary. On the 3rd night, Margaret found her father in the kitchen at 2 a.m., standing by the window and looking at the stars. She stood in the doorway watching him. He turned, smiled, and offered coffee. They sat together in companionable silence, the kind that exists between people who've stopped trying to fix each other. Then Margaret asked the question she'd been carrying all week. Had something happened to him? He seemed different, lighter somehow, less haunted. Harold considered lying, offering some easy explanation about getting older or finding peace after her mother's death. But the being had shown him that truth, real truth, could be felt even when words failed. So he told her. He described the night the stars stopped moving, the craft in the wheat field, the being made of light, the visions of humanity standing at a threshold, about to remember what it had forgotten. He spoke carefully, gently, knowing how insane it sounded but unable to deny what had happened. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she didn't call him crazy or suggest therapy. Instead, she reached across the table and took his weathered hand in her own. She told him she believed him, not because the story made sense, but because she could see the truth of it in his eyes, in the way he carried himself, in the peace that had replaced the bitterness she'd known her whole life. Something had touched him, something real. They sat together until dawn, talking about God and meaning and the strange beauty of being alive. For the first time in decades, Harold felt like a father again, not because he had wisdom to offer, but because he'd finally learned to simply be present. Before Margaret left, she hugged him longer than necessary. She whispered that she'd been angry at God for taking her mother, angry at her father for being unavailable, angry at herself for holding on to resentment. But something in that house, in those conversations, had begun melting the ice around her heart. Harold watched her drive away, knowing he might not see her again for months. But something had shifted between them. A bridge had been built, and that bridge felt like a small miracle, the kind the being had promised, the kind that changes everything while looking like nothing at all. Winter deepened. Harold spent long evenings reading his grandmother's Bible, finding new meanings in passages he'd memorized as a child. The words hadn't changed, but he had. He could see now what the poets and prophets had been trying to communicate, that the kingdom wasn't a place you went when you died. It was a state of consciousness you awakened to while still breathing. The light beings, the angels, the travelers between worlds, they were all pointing at the same truth. Humanity had never been separate from the divine. The separation was a story people told themselves, a temporary amnesia necessary for the journey. But the forgetting was ending. Harold began noticing others who carried that same quality of presence. The young woman who worked at the grocery store, who looked at every customer like they mattered. The mechanic in town who fixed Harold's tractor and refused payment, saying he just enjoyed helping people keep their equipment running. The librarian who recommended books with such care, as if she understood that stories could save lives. These people might never have encounters with craft from distant stars, but they were waking up anyway. The transformation was happening quietly, person by person, moment by moment, like seeds germinating beneath winter snow. Harold wondered sometimes if his encounter had been unique, or if thousands, maybe millions, of similar contacts were happening worldwide, each person shown a piece of the larger truth, each given whatever revelation their mind could hold. Perhaps the universe worked like that, offering custom-tailored epiphanies designed for individual understanding. February brought a late-season blizzard. Harold woke to find his farmhouse buried under 3 feet of snow, power lines down, roads impassable. In his youth, this would have meant panic, checking on livestock, worrying about pipes freezing, feeling trapped and anxious. But something in him had changed. He built a fire in the wood stove, heated soup on a camping burner, and spent the day reading by candlelight. The silence felt sacred rather than threatening. The isolation felt like retreat rather than exile. When the storm finally passed and Earl Patterson came by to check on him, he found Harold in perfect peace, as if the blizzard had been a blessing rather than a burden. Earl stood in the doorway, shaking his head in wonder, saying he'd never seen anyone so content being snowed in alone. Harold offered coffee and homemade bread. They sat together, 2 aging farmers who'd known each other 40 years, and something unspoken passed between them. Earl mentioned that his wife was dying. Cancer, stage 4, maybe weeks left. He'd been carrying this terror like a stone in his chest, unable to sleep, unable to pray, unable to find peace. Harold didn't offer platitudes. He didn't say everything happens for a reason, or that God works in mysterious ways. Instead, he placed his hand on Earl's shoulder and shared what the being had shown him, that death was transition, not ending. That consciousness continued, transformed, but unbroken. That love was the fundamental force holding reality together, and nothing built on love could ever be truly lost. He spoke carefully, knowing these words could sound hollow to someone in Earl's pain, but something in the way he said them, or perhaps something in the silence that followed, seemed to reach his friend. Earl's shoulders relaxed slightly. The terror in his eyes softened into something else, not acceptance exactly, but willingness to consider that maybe, just maybe, death wasn't the enemy he'd always imagined. They sat together for 3 hours. When Earl finally left, he embraced Harold with the intensity of a drowning man finding shore. He didn't say thank you because words felt insufficient, but Harold knew. He could feel the shift, the slight opening where terror had begun giving way to trust. March arrived with early warmth. Harold planted his fields, moving through familiar rhythms with new awareness. Each seed felt like a prayer, each row like a meditation. The work no longer felt like labor, but like participation in something vast and intentional. The earth bringing forth life, consciousness expressing itself through corn and wheat and soil. He began keeping a journal, not to record events, but to capture the insights that arrived unexpectedly during ordinary moments. While repairing fence posts, he'd suddenly understand something about forgiveness. While washing dishes, clarity would emerge about the nature of time. The being had left something in him, a kind of antenna that could now receive signals he'd been deaf to before. The journal filled with strange, beautiful observations that would sound insane to anyone else. But Harold wasn't writing for others. He was writing to remember, to honor the transformation happening inside him, to leave some record that this had all been real. One evening in late March, as spring peepers sang in the creek bottom, Harold experienced another vision. He hadn't sought it, hadn't even been thinking about the encounter. He was simply sitting in his chair, watching stars emerge, when the knowing returned. This time, there was no craft, no physical being. The presence arrived as pure consciousness, filling the space around him with that familiar warmth. It showed him the next phase, not through images, but through feeling, the transformation accelerating, the threshold approaching faster than anyone expected, souls beginning to shift, reality becoming more fluid, the boundary between physical and spiritual growing permeable. The being reminded him that his role was simple: be present, be loving, be willing. Those who were ready would recognize what he carried not through his words, but through his being. He wasn't meant to convince anyone or prove anything. He was simply meant to live as a demonstration that transformation was possible, that awakening was real, that love could become someone's fundamental operating system. When the vision released him, Harold sat in his chair weeping, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. He'd been chosen for this not because he was special, but because he'd been available, because loneliness and loss had emptied him enough to receive what was being offered, because his life had taught him humility, and humility was the doorway through which truth could enter. April brought Margaret back for Easter. She came alone this time, leaving her family in Denver, needing time with her father. They spent the weekend working in the garden together, planting vegetables and perennials, talking about everything and nothing. On Easter morning, Margaret asked if they could skip church. She wanted to stay at the farm, to experience whatever it was her father had found. So they sat together on the porch, drinking coffee and watching sunrise paint the fields gold. Margaret asked him to tell her again about the being, about what it had shown him. So Harold described it once more, the patterns woven through existence, the consciousness filling every corner of reality, the transformation approaching like dawn after an endless night. Then Margaret shared her own experience. 2 weeks earlier, she'd woken at 3 a.m. filled with inexplicable peace. No dream had preceded it, no reason for the feeling, but suddenly she'd known, with absolute certainty, that her mother wasn't gone. That consciousness continued. That love was eternal and unbreakable. The knowing had lasted maybe 10 seconds before her rational mind reasserted itself, but those 10 seconds had changed something fundamental inside her. Harold smiled. The being had told him this would happen, that awakening was contagious, that consciousness recognized itself across apparent separation. Margaret hadn't needed a craft to land in her Denver backyard. She'd simply been ready, and readiness was the only requirement. They sat together in silence, father and daughter, both carrying their own encounters with the infinite, both learning to trust what their hearts knew, even when their minds couldn't explain it. As Margaret prepared to leave that evening, she asked her father if he was afraid of what was coming, of the transformation he'd described, of the threshold humanity was approaching. Harold considered the question carefully. Then he told her about something the being had shown him during that initial encounter, that fear and love couldn't occupy the same space, that every moment offered a choice to contract into separation or expand into connection, that the transformation wasn't something happening to people, but something they were choosing moment by moment, breath by breath. He wasn't afraid, because he'd learned to trust the force that held stars in their orbits and guided migrations and caused seeds to split open. That same intelligence was guiding this transition, and it was built from love, not judgment. Those who were ready would recognize home when they arrived. Those who weren't would continue their journey at their own pace. Margaret hugged him goodbye, whispering that she loved him, that she was grateful for whatever had happened in that wheat field, that she could see the change, and it was beautiful. After she left, Harold stood in his driveway until her taillights disappeared. Then he walked to his wheat field, the same field where the craft had landed 6 months ago, and knelt in the soil. He placed his hands against the earth and felt it humming, alive, conscious. Everything was alive. Everything was conscious. The separation between matter and spirit was illusion, a temporary stage in consciousness learning to recognize itself. Harold began laughing again, that same surprised laughter that had seized him in his kitchen months ago. He was kneeling in a wheat field in Nebraska, having conversations with beings made of light, watching the world transform around him, and somehow it all made perfect sense. More sense than anything had ever made before. The stars emerged overhead. Harold lay back in the wheat, looking up at the infinite expanse, feeling himself part of it rather than separate from it. Somewhere up there, the travelers continued their journey, witnessing transformation on countless worlds, holding space for species learning to remember what they'd forgotten. And here on this small farm in this quiet corner of Nebraska, one man was learning the same lesson humanity had been preparing for across millennia. That home wasn't a place you returned to, but a consciousness you awakened to, and it had been waiting patiently all along, as close as his next breath. Summer arrived with a heat that seemed to carry weight, as if the atmosphere itself had grown denser with anticipation. Harold worked his fields in the early mornings, Before the sun climbed high enough to make labor dangerous, the wheat grew tall and golden, reaching toward a sky that felt closer somehow, more present, as if the boundary between earth and heaven had grown permeable. Other changes came gradually, so subtle that Harold might have missed them if he hadn't been paying attention. Birds behaved differently, gathering in unusual patterns, singing at odd hours, watching him with intelligence that felt almost human. His dog, old Rex, began sitting for hours staring at empty corners of the barn, tail wagging at something Harold couldn't see but could feel pressing against the edges of perception. The veil was thinning. That's how the being had described it during their encounter. Not as apocalypse, but as revelation. Not as ending, but as unveiling. The world wasn't preparing to be destroyed, but to be seen clearly for the first time. What humanity had called supernatural was simply nature operating at frequencies most people couldn't yet perceive. But that was changing. Harold began hearing reports from others, though few spoke openly about their experiences. The woman at the post office mentioned dreams that felt more real than waking life, visions of beings made of light, messages about transformation, warnings wrapped in love. She spoke nervously, watching Harold's face for signs of judgment, relaxing only when she saw understanding there. The mechanic in town admitted he'd been seeing lights over his garage for weeks, not threatening, just present, observing. His tools had begun working better, lasting longer, as if blessed by invisible hands. He laughed awkwardly when he said this, but Harold could see the wonder beneath the embarrassment. Pastor Jim Holloway stopped by the farm one afternoon in June, ostensibly to check on Harold, but really seeking something else. They sat on the porch drinking iced tea, talking about weather and crops, circling around what the pastor really wanted to discuss. Finally, Jim set down his glass and asked directly, had Harold experienced anything unusual? Anything that might explain the strange peace he seemed to carry, the way people in town were starting to notice? Harold looked at this man who'd presided over his wife's funeral, who'd offered tired platitudes that hadn't touched the grief, and made a decision. He told him everything, the craft, the being, the visions of transformation, the knowing that settled in his bones like truth made solid. Pastor Jim listened without interrupting. When Harold finished, the old minister sat silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. Then he confessed something he'd never told anyone. 3 weeks earlier, during morning prayer, he'd experienced a vision so powerful it had knocked him to his knees. He'd seen Jesus, not as the pale figure from stained glass windows, but as light itself, speaking without words, showing him that everything the church had been teaching was both true and incomplete. The doctrines were maps, not territory. The rituals were fingers pointing at the moon, not the moon itself. Salvation wasn't about believing the right things, but about awakening to what had always been true, that every soul was already held in love, already home, already saved. The only thing separating humanity from this truth was forgetting, and the forgetting was ending. Jim's voice broke as he described this revelation. His entire ministry, 40 years of preaching, had been built on a framework that suddenly felt too small, too rigid, too concerned with rules and not enough with relationship. He'd spent weeks terrified that he was losing his faith, only to slowly realize he was finding it for the first time. Harold reached across and gripped the pastor's shoulder. He understood. The being had shown him that truth was too large to fit in any single container. Every religion, every system of belief held pieces of the larger pattern. The tragedy was when people mistook their piece for the whole, when they built walls instead of windows, when they used truth as a weapon rather than a bridge. But that phase was ending. The transformation approaching would dissolve those walls, not through destruction, but through expansion. People would simply outgrow the containers that had served them, the way children outgrow clothes. What remained would be essence, pure relationship with the source, unmediated by institution or interpretation. The two men sat together as afternoon shadows lengthened, sharing their encounters, their doubts, their growing certainty that something vast and loving was moving through the world, preparing humanity for a shift that would change everything, while somehow changing nothing at all. The truth had always been true. People were simply beginning to see it. Before Pastor Jim left, he asked Harold a question that had been troubling him. If transformation was coming, if awakening was accelerating, what about those who weren't ready? What happened to people who couldn't or wouldn't shift into this new consciousness? Harold shared what the being had shown him, that no one was lost, no one abandoned. Those who remained would continue their journey at their own pace, living and learning and dying and being born again until they too were ready. The universe held infinite patience. Time was an illusion designed to allow growth to happen gradually, and growth couldn't be rushed without destroying what it was meant to develop. Some souls needed more seasons in this particular classroom, and that was perfect, that was allowed. Love didn't demand transformation on anyone's timeline but its own, and love's timeline was measured in eternities, not lifetimes. Jim drove away looking lighter, as if a burden he'd carried for decades had finally been lifted. Harold watched the dust settle on the gravel road and felt gratitude for the being who'd shown him that ministry wasn't about preaching, but about presence, about being available when others were ready to hear what they'd been carrying alone. July brought storms that shook the farmhouse and turned the sky shades of green and purple Harold had never seen before. During one particularly violent thunderstorm, he stood on his porch watching lightning fracture the darkness, feeling electricity in the air that had nothing to do with weather. The craft appeared in the midst of the storm, hovering above his wheat field, unaffected by wind or rain. This time Harold wasn't surprised. He grabbed his raincoat and walked into the tempest, feeling neither fear nor doubt, only recognition. The being had returned. But this encounter was different. The craft didn't land. Instead, it projected something, not light exactly, but presence made visible. Harold stood in pouring rain, looking up at patterns that moved and shifted, creating shapes his eyes couldn't quite hold. The being was showing him something about the storm itself, about the way consciousness moved through all phenomena, the way weather was prayer made visible, the earth crying and laughing and breathing. Understanding flooded through him, without words. Every storm was a conversation. Every raindrop carried intention. The natural world wasn't separate from consciousness, but was consciousness expressing itself, learning itself, becoming aware of itself through infinite forms. The being showed him that the approaching transformation would restore this understanding. Humanity would remember it was part of nature, not above it or separate from it. The divorce between spirit and matter, between human and animal, between sacred and mundane, all these false divisions would dissolve like mist in morning sun. What remained would be participation, conscious, intentional, loving participation in the vast ecology of being that included everything from quarks to galaxies, from bacteria to angels, from soil to starlight, all of it alive, all of it aware, all of it held in a love so vast that human language had no words for it. The vision released him. Harold stood soaked to the bone in his wheat field, rain streaming down his face, laughing and crying simultaneously. The craft rose slowly, dissolving into the storm clouds, leaving only the feeling of its presence, a warmth in his chest that would never entirely fade. He walked back to his farmhouse moving differently, as if gravity had loosened its hold slightly. Everything looked sharper, more vivid, more real. He could see patterns everywhere, in the way rain pooled on his porch, in the structure of leaves, in the arrangement of clouds. The universe was writing itself constantly, telling its story through every molecule, and he could finally read the language. August brought heat that turned the wheat fields amber. Harold harvested his crop with borrowed equipment and help from Earl Patterson, who'd been different since his wife passed in May. Earl didn't speak much anymore, but he carried a new quality, not grief exactly, but depth, as if loss had cracked him open and revealed something essential underneath. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, two old men who'd known each other longer than they'd known most of their own thoughts. During a break, Earl mentioned something odd. Since his wife died, he'd been having experiences he couldn't explain. Moments where he felt her presence so strongly he'd turn around expecting to see her. Dreams that felt like actual conversations, where she assured him she was fine, that death was just stepping into another room. Harold listened carefully. Then he shared what the being had shown him about consciousness continuing after death, about love being eternal and unbreakable, about the thin veil between worlds growing thinner still as the transformation approached. Earl absorbed this quietly, chewing on a piece of wheat stem, eyes distant. Finally he spoke, saying he'd stopped going to church because the sermons about heaven and hell didn't match what he was experiencing. His wife wasn't somewhere far away waiting for judgment. She was close, closer than breath, present in ways that made the old religious frameworks feel empty. Harold understood. The being had revealed that humanity's ideas about afterlife were both crude and beautiful, crude in their literal interpretation, beautiful in their attempt to describe something words couldn't hold. The truth was simpler and stranger than any doctrine. Consciousness didn't go anywhere when bodies died, because consciousness had never been limited to bodies in the first place. The two men sat together watching dust devils dance across harvested fields, both carrying their own encounters with the infinite, both learning to trust what their hearts knew, even when their minds couldn't explain it. September arrived with cooler temperatures and clarity that made distant horizons sharp enough to cut glass. Harold spent his evenings preparing for winter, stacking firewood, checking equipment, sealing windows, but these tasks felt different now. Not like preparation for hardship, but like rituals of gratitude, ways of honoring the shelter that protected him, the land that fed him, the cycles that sustained all life. He began noticing more people experiencing their own awakenings. The grocery clerk, who spoke about feeling connected to everything, as if she could sense the consciousness flowing through customers and merchandise alike. The teenager bagging groceries who mentioned seeing auras around people, not trying to see them, just suddenly perceiving light that had always been there but invisible until now. The transformation wasn't coming. It was already here, spreading like dawn across a darkened world, waking people one by one, preparing humanity for a shift that couldn't be stopped or controlled or scheduled, but only received with open hands. Harold began hosting informal gatherings at his farmhouse, not church services, not organized meetings, just people coming together to share their experiences, their questions, their growing certainty that reality was far stranger and more beautiful than they'd been taught. Pastor Jim came regularly, bringing others from his congregation who'd had experiences they couldn't discuss in traditional settings. The mechanic brought his wife, Earl brought neighbors. The gatherings grew organically, word spreading quietly through Harlan County that something was happening at the Brennan farm, something worth experiencing, even if you couldn't name it. They sat in Harold's living room or on his porch, drinking coffee or tea, sharing stories that would sound insane to outsiders, but resonated with truth to those who'd experienced their own encounters. The woman who'd seen her deceased son in a dream so vivid, she woke knowing death was illusion. The farmer who'd had a craft hover over his barn, leaving him with understanding he couldn't articulate, but that changed everything. The teacher who'd experienced unity consciousness during meditation, suddenly knowing herself as not separate from, but continuous with all existence. Harold didn't lead these gatherings. He simply held space, allowing others to speak their truth without judgment, creating an environment where the unusual could be acknowledged, where transformation could be named without fear. What emerged from these conversations was a pattern. Almost everyone described the same core experience, a sudden knowing that they were loved, that they'd always been loved, that separation was illusion and connection was the fundamental truth holding everything together. The specific details varied: lights in the sky, visions during prayer, near-death experiences, spontaneous awakenings, but the essence remained constant. Love was real. Love was fundamental. Love was the force that built worlds and held them, and would eventually transform them into something beyond current human comprehension. October returned, bringing the anniversary of Harold's initial encounter. He marked the date quietly, walking out to his wheat field at the same hour the craft had first appeared. The field stood empty now, harvested and resting, preparing for winter's sleep and spring's resurrection. Harold knelt in the stubble and placed his hands on the earth, feeling its aliveness, its consciousness, its patient waiting for the next cycle to begin. He thought about everything that had changed in 12 months, his relationship with Margaret healed, his understanding of reality transformed, his fear of death replaced by curiosity about what lay beyond the veil. But more than personal changes, he'd witnessed the beginning of something collective. The transformation the being had described wasn't happening in some distant future. It was unfolding now, quietly but unstoppably, like spring thaw after long winter. As he knelt there, Harold experienced one final vision, not from an external source this time, but from somewhere deep within himself, as if the being had left a seed that was now bearing fruit. He saw the earth from above, glowing with increasing light as more and more people awakened to their true nature. He saw networks of consciousness forming, connecting across apparent separation, weaving a new pattern into reality itself. He saw that the transformation wouldn't be dramatic or catastrophic. It would be gradual, organic, natural, like seeds germinating, like dawn spreading, like ice melting. Those who were ready would simply shift, moving into a state of consciousness where love wasn't an emotion, but the ground of being, where separation was seen as the temporary illusion it had always been, where death was recognized as transition rather than ending. And those who weren't ready, they would continue learning, continue growing, continue preparing until their own moment of awakening arrived. No one was excluded. No one was judged. The universe held infinite patience for every soul to find its own way home. The vision showed him one final thing, that his role in this transformation was complete. He'd been a witness, a vessel, a demonstration that awakening was possible for ordinary people in ordinary places. But he didn't need to convince anyone or prove anything. His purpose was simply to live as a walking reminder that transformation was real, that love could become someone's operating system, that the extraordinary could flower in the midst of the mundane. When the vision released him, Harold found himself weeping again, not from sadness but from overwhelming gratitude. He'd been given a gift beyond measure, shown truths that made his entire life make sense, prepared for a transition that would eventually take everyone home. He stood slowly, his knees protesting but his heart light. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of gold and copper that seemed almost artificial in their beauty. Harold watched until the last light faded, then walked back to his farmhouse carrying peace like a candle flame. November brought the first serious snow. Harold prepared for Thanksgiving, cleaning his house with care, cooking dishes his wife had taught him decades ago. Margaret was coming with her whole family this time, and others from the gatherings had asked if they could join, not for religious observance but simply to be together, to share a meal, to acknowledge the strange and beautiful transformation happening in their lives. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and clear. Harold's farmhouse filled with people, some family, some friends, some strangers, who'd heard about the gatherings and wanted to experience whatever was happening in Harlan County. They cooked together, laughed together, shared stories about their lives and their encounters with the infinite. During the meal, Margaret asked her father to share his story one more time, not just for her family, but for everyone present. So Harold stood at the head of his kitchen table, surrounded by faces illuminated by candlelight, and told them about the night the stars stopped moving. He described the craft landing in his wheat field, the being made of light, the visions of transformation approaching like dawn after endless night. He spoke about consciousness flowing through all things, about death being transition rather than ending, about love being the fundamental force holding reality together. But more than describing events, Harold shared what he'd learned. That transformation began not with dramatic encounters, but with small choices. The choice to listen instead of speak, the choice to forgive instead of resent, the choice to see consciousness in everything, rather than assuming humanity was the only awareness in an otherwise dead universe. When he finished, silence filled the room. Then Pastor Jim stood and shared his own encounter. Then Earl spoke about sensing his wife's continued presence. Then the mechanic described lights over his garage. One by one, people around the table shared their experiences, their questions, their growing certainty that reality was far stranger and more beautiful than they'd been taught. What emerged from that Thanksgiving gathering was understanding, not intellectual comprehension, but heart knowledge. Everyone present could feel the transformation happening, not just in the world but in themselves. Fear was giving way to trust. Separation was yielding to connection. The old frameworks that had divided humanity from itself and from the larger universe were dissolving like morning fog. After the meal, Harold's grandson, 8 years old, unburdened by adult skepticism, asked a question that silenced everyone. He wanted to know if the aliens were angels, and if angels were aliens, and if maybe it was all the same thing, just wearing different clothes. Harold knelt to his grandson's level, looking into eyes that carried ancient wisdom wrapped in childhood innocence. He told the boy that names were less important than what they pointed toward, that consciousness expressed itself in infinite forms across infinite dimensions, that some people called them angels and others called them aliens, and maybe both words were trying to describe something language couldn't quite hold. What mattered wasn't what you called them, but what they showed you, that you were loved, that you were never alone, that the universe was conscious and intentional and holding you gently every moment of your life. The boy considered this seriously, then nodded as if Harold had simply confirmed what he'd already known. Children understood these things more easily than adults, Harold realized. They hadn't yet built the walls that made mystery feel threatening rather than inviting. As evening came and guests began leaving, Harold stood on his porch watching taillights disappear down the gravel road. Margaret came and stood beside him, slipping her hand into his weathered one. She told him she was grateful for his honesty, for his willingness to share what he'd experienced, for demonstrating that transformation was possible even for people who thought they were too old or too broken or too ordinary. Watching him change had given her permission to change as well, to trust the strange experiences she'd been having, to believe that maybe consciousness really did continue after death, and love really was eternal. Harold squeezed her hand, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. This was the real miracle, he realized. Not the craft in his wheat field, but the healing of relationships, the restoration of trust, the bridges built between human hearts. The being had shown him cosmic truths, but the most profound transformation was happening in small, intimate ways. A father and daughter learning to love each other without conditions, without resentment, without the weight of old wounds. December arrived with cold that seemed to sharpen everything, making stars more brilliant and silence more profound. Harold spent his evenings by the fire, reading and reflecting, preparing for whatever came next. He could feel something approaching, not threatening but significant, like the moment before sunrise when darkness begins yielding to light. On the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, Harold experienced his final vision. It came not dramatically but gently, slipping into his awareness like a memory that had always been there but forgotten. The being appeared in his living room, not physically but as presence, as consciousness made palpable. It showed him that the transformation was accelerating, that the threshold he'd been shown 12 months ago was now visible on the horizon. Within his lifetime, perhaps within months, the shift would become undeniable. People all over the world were awakening simultaneously, each having their own unique encounter, but all receiving the same essential message, that love was real, that consciousness was eternal, that separation was illusion, that home was never far, because home was the ground of being itself. The being revealed that Harold's work was done. He'd served as a witness, a demonstration, a living proof that ordinary people could experience extraordinary transformation, but he didn't need to do more. His role now was simply to be, to exist as a reminder that the impossible was possible, that the universe was conscious and loving and holding everyone gently. Then the being showed him something that made Harold gasp with recognition and joy. He saw that when his time came to die, whether tomorrow or in decades, there would be no fear, no struggle, no darkness. He would simply shift, moving from one state of consciousness to another as easily as stepping from one room into the next. Death was a doorway, and on the other side waited everything he'd lost and everything he'd never known, but had always been seeking. His wife was there, his parents, friends and family and strangers who somehow felt familiar, and beyond them, woven through all of it, was the light that remembered and the love that built worlds. The consciousness he'd been calling God, but which was so much larger and more intimate than any name could contain. The vision showed him that this wasn't heaven in the traditional sense. It was simply home, the place all souls returned to between incarnations, the rest stopped between lessons, the sanctuary where consciousness could remember what it had forgotten during its journey through limitation and form. When the vision released him, Harold found himself on his knees beside his fireplace, tears streaming down his face, heart overflowing with gratitude so intense it felt almost unbearable. He understood now why the mystics and prophets had always struggled to describe their encounters. Language couldn't hold this. Words couldn't contain this. The only way to communicate truth this large was to live it, to embody it, to become a walking demonstration of transformation. Harold spent Christmas alone by choice, wanting solitude to integrate everything he'd experienced. He cooked a simple meal, read his grandmother's Bible, sat by the fire watching flames dance and thinking about the strange journey his life had become. A year ago he'd been a lonely old farmer waiting to die, wondering if his life had mattered, questioning whether God remembered his name. Now he was a man who'd touched the infinite, who carried truth in his bones, who understood that every life mattered because every life was consciousness learning itself, and consciousness was the only thing that had ever truly existed. The old frameworks that had divided reality into sacred and mundane, spiritual and material, human and divine, all of them were dissolving. What remained was participation, relationship, love, expressed through infinite forms across infinite dimensions. Harold went to bed Christmas night feeling complete, not finished but whole. His life had become exactly what the being said all lives eventually became. A demonstration that transformation was real, that awakening was possible, that love was the fundamental force holding everything together. January arrived with bitter cold that froze the ground solid. Harold maintained his routines, feeding chickens, checking equipment, preparing for spring. But everything carried new meaning. He was no longer just a farmer maintaining land. He was consciousness participating in the vast ecology of being, honoring his role in patterns that included everything from soil bacteria to distant stars. The gatherings at his farmhouse continued through winter, growing larger as word spread beyond Harlan County. People drove from neighboring states, seeking whatever was happening at the Brennan farm, hoping to experience their own awakening, or simply to be in the presence of others who'd had encounters they couldn't explain to family or friends. Harold welcomed them all. His farmhouse became an unofficial sanctuary where the unusual could be acknowledged, where transformation could be named without judgment, where people could share their truth without fear of being called crazy or delusional. What struck Harold most was the diversity of experiences. Some people had seen craft, others had experienced unity consciousness during meditation, some had near-death experiences that revealed death as illusion, others simply woke one morning knowing, with absolute certainty, that they were loved, had always been loved, would always be loved. The specifics varied endlessly, but the essence remained constant. The universe was conscious. Love was fundamental. Transformation was accelerating. Humanity was approaching a threshold that would change everything while changing nothing at all. February brought storms that tested the old farmhouse, wind rattling windows and snow piling against doors. During one particularly violent blizzard, Harold lost power for 3 days. He burned firewood and candles cooked on his camping stove and discovered that isolation felt less like punishment and more like retreat. On the third night of the storm, sitting by firelight and watching shadows dance on walls, Harold had a realization that made him laugh out loud. He'd spent his entire life afraid of being alone, equating solitude with loneliness, interpreting quiet as absence. But the being had shown him that aloneness was impossible. Consciousness filled everything. He was never isolated because he was continuous with all existence, connected to every person and animal and plant, woven into patterns that included galaxies and quarks, held constantly in a love so vast that separation was revealed as the temporary illusion it had always been. Understanding this changed everything. Solitude became communion. Silence became conversation. The empty farmhouse felt full because it was full, filled with presence, with consciousness, with the infinite expressing itself through finite form. When power returned and roads cleared, Earl stopped by to check on Harold. He found his friend in perfect peace, glowing with something Earl couldn't name but recognized nonetheless. They sat together drinking coffee, and Earl mentioned that he'd been experiencing something similar, a growing sense that his wife wasn't gone, that consciousness continued, that love was literally the force holding atoms together. Harold smiled. The transformation was spreading exactly as the being had shown him, not through preaching or convincing, but through presence, through demonstration, through people simply living their truth and allowing others to recognize it when they were ready. March arrived with early warmth that coaxed green shoots from frozen ground. Harold prepared his fields for planting, moving through familiar rhythms that now felt sacred. Every seed was prayer, every furrow was meditation. The work wasn't separate from spirituality, but was spirituality, consciousness participating in its own unfolding, the universe experiencing itself through the hands of an aging farmer. On the anniversary of his second encounter, the night the being had appeared during the storm, Harold walked out to his wheat field and stood beneath stars that seemed closer than ever. He could feel something approaching, gathering momentum like water finding its level. The transformation was no longer approaching. It was here, happening now, spreading through humanity like dawn, erasing darkness. Those who were ready were waking up. Those who weren't were being held gently, given whatever time they needed to prepare for their own moment of recognition. Harold raised his face to the stars and spoke aloud for the first time since his initial encounter. Not prayer exactly, but acknowledgement, gratitude, recognition that he'd been chosen for this, not because he was special, but because he'd been available, because loss had emptied him enough to receive what was being offered, because his life had taught him humility, and humility was the doorway through which truth could enter. No response came, no vision, no presence descending from the sky, but Harold didn't need confirmation anymore. The truth lived in his bones, in his breath, in the way he moved through the world carrying peace like a candle flame. He walked back to his farmhouse under stars that sang silent songs about transformation and awakening, and the beautiful, terrible gift of consciousness, learning to recognize itself. April brought Margaret and her family for Easter weekend, but this time was different. Margaret's husband pulled Harold aside and shared that he'd been having his own experiences, dreams of beings made of light, sudden knowings that death was illusion, moments where he felt connected to everything, in ways that made his rational mind short-circuit. Harold listened, offered what understanding he could, but mostly he simply witnessed. This was his role now, not teacher but mirror, reflecting back to others what they were discovering within themselves. On Easter morning, the family gathered on Harold's porch to watch sunrise. His grandson asked if the aliens would come back. Harold knelt beside the boy and told him that they'd never left. They were always present, always watching, always holding space for humanity's transformation. You just had to know how to see them. The boy nodded solemnly, then pointed at the horizon, where dawn was breaking. He said he could see them, angels or aliens or something without a name, moving through the light, celebrating with creation as another day began. Harold looked where his grandson pointed and realized the boy was right. Not in the literal sense, perhaps, but in the way that mattered. Consciousness filled everything. The boundary between physical and spiritual was dissolving. Children could see this more easily than adults because they hadn't yet learned to deny what their hearts knew. As the sun cleared the horizon, painting the world gold and copper, Harold felt overwhelming gratitude for the journey his life had become. From lonely farmer waiting to die to witness of transformation, from man who'd forgotten his purpose to demonstration that awakening was possible for anyone willing to receive it. The being had told him that his work was done, but Harold understood now that the work was never done. Transformation was ongoing, eternal, infinite. There was no final destination, no moment when consciousness stopped learning itself. There was only this, the eternal present, the endless now, the moment when everything that had ever been and everything that would ever be existed simultaneously. May brought planting season. Harold worked his fields with Earl's help, both men moving more slowly now, but carrying something that made age feel less like burden and more like earned wisdom. They didn't speak much while working, but silence between them held depth, the kind of understanding that exists between people who've touched the infinite and returned, changed. During breaks, they sat at the field's edge drinking water and watching clouds drift across endless sky. Earl mentioned that he'd started having dreams about his wife again, but different this time. She wasn't sad or distant. She was radiant, whole, trying to show him that death had freed her into something larger than he could currently comprehend. Harold understood. The being had shown him that souls weren't trapped in heaven or hell, but were learning, growing, preparing for their next expression. Death wasn't punishment or reward. It was simply transition, consciousness shifting from one classroom to another, gathering new perspectives, preparing for deeper understanding. June brought thunderstorms that seemed to carry messages. Harold stood on his porch during one particularly violent tempest, watching lightning fracture darkness, feeling electricity in the air that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the transformation accelerating through reality itself. He could feel it now, not as abstract concept, but as tangible shift, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of visible events. Consciousness was waking up globally. People everywhere were having encounters, receiving visions, experiencing sudden knowings that shattered old frameworks and revealed new possibilities. The threshold was visible now, not years away but approaching rapidly, like sunrise inevitable and unstoppable. Harold knew he wouldn't live to see the full transformation. His body was aging, wearing out, preparing for its own transition. But that didn't matter. He'd played his role. He'd been the witness, the demonstration, the walking proof that transformation was real. Others would carry it forward. The teenager at the grocery store who saw auras, Pastor Jim who'd experienced vision during prayer, Margaret who was learning to trust her own encounters, Earl who felt his wife's continued presence, the boy who saw angels dancing in dawn light. The transformation didn't depend on any single person. It was inevitable, written into the structure of consciousness itself. Humanity had been preparing for this across millennia, building toward the moment when enough people awakened to shift the entire species into new understanding. July arrived with heat that shimmered. Harold moved slowly through his days, feeling his body protest but his spirit soar. He was ready, not eager to die but willing, understanding that what lay ahead was transition, not ending, doorway, not wall. On a sweltering afternoon, while resting in his lawn chair beneath stars not yet visible, Harold felt the familiar presence return one final time. The being didn't appear physically. It simply existed there, holding space, offering acknowledgement. Without words, it showed Harold that everything had unfolded exactly as intended. His life, his losses, his loneliness, all of it had prepared him to receive what was offered that October night when stars stopped moving. And receiving it, he'd become a vessel through which transformation could spread to others. The being revealed that millions of similar contacts were happening worldwide, each unique, each perfectly designed for individual understanding, each contributing to the collective awakening accelerating through humanity. Then it showed him one final thing that made Harold weep with joy. When his time came to transition, the being would be there, not to judge or evaluate, but to welcome, to celebrate, to guide him home. Death would be gentle, death would be beautiful, death would be exactly what he'd been seeking his entire life without knowing it. Complete reunion with the source, total remembrance of who and what he'd always been. The presence faded. Harold sat alone in his lawn chair, as stars emerged one by one, filling the sky with ancient light that had traveled impossible distances to reach his eyes in this moment. He understood now why the mystics smiled, why the prophets laughed, why people who'd touched the infinite carried peace that circumstances couldn't shake. They'd seen behind the curtain, they'd glimpsed the pattern holding everything together, and having seen it, fear became impossible because fear required believing in separation, and separation was revealed as the temporary illusion it had always been. Harold sat beneath those stars until dawn, feeling gratitude so intense it bordered on unbearable. He'd been given a gift beyond measure, not just the encounter with the being but the transformation that followed, the healing with Margaret, the community that gathered in his farmhouse, the peace that had replaced fear. As sunrise approached, painting the eastern horizon shades of gold and rose, Harold spoke aloud one final time, not to the being or to God or to anyone specific, just acknowledgement, gratitude, recognition, thank you. Two words that contained everything. Gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, for the love that had held him even when he couldn't feel it, for the transformation that had turned an ordinary life into demonstration that the extraordinary was possible for anyone willing to receive it. The sun cleared the horizon. Harold closed his eyes and felt warmth on his weathered face. When he opened them again, the world looked different, sharper, more vivid, more real, as if he was seeing creation clearly for the first time. Perhaps he was. Perhaps this was what awakening meant, not acquiring new knowledge but removing filters, dissolving walls, clearing away everything that obscured the truth that had always been present, obvious, waiting patiently to be recognized. Harold stood slowly and walked toward his farmhouse. His knees ached, his back protested. But these sensations felt different now. Not burden but information, not suffering but sensation, not problem but simply what was. He had work to do, fields to maintain, animals to feed, a life to live. The transformation hadn't made mundane tasks disappear. It had revealed them as sacred, as participation in patterns larger than individual understanding, as the universe experiencing itself through the hands of an aging farmer in Nebraska. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Perhaps the heavens were never above us at all. Perhaps they were always the light that appears when we stop running from what we've been seeking. Perhaps transformation doesn't require dramatic encounters with beings made of starlight. Perhaps it only requires willingness to see clearly, to love fully, to trust that consciousness holds us gently every moment of our existence. Harold Brennan discovered this truth in a wheat field one October night, but the truth itself had been waiting since the beginning. Patient as dawn, constant as breath, close enough to touch if only we remembered how to see. The stars never stopped moving. We simply stopped believing we were separate from their dance.